Welcome, everybody, to the second day of Translation, Interpreting and Culture Conference. This is the second time this conference is taking place, and the topic of this year's conference is Rehumanizing Translation and Interpreting Studies. And the first thing in this morning is a very special privilege for us all, and I'm honored to welcome here Professor Susan Bassnett, who is a distinguished translation studies scholar and comparative literature expert at the University of Warwick and the University of Glasgow in the UK. It is great honor for all of us and for me to be able to chair or to be able to talk to you, dear Professor. So let me just briefly introduce our first keynote speaker. Today, Susan Bassnett was educated in Denmark, Portugal, and Italy, acquiring various languages in childhood. She established postgraduate programs in comparative literature and then in translation studies at the University of Warwick, where she also served twice as pro-vice-chancellor. She continues to lecture and run workshops around the world, and her current research is on translation and memory. But as I have also learned on concrete poetry, translation of concrete poetry. Among other books, she authored Translation Studies, currently in its 4th edition, and comparative literature, both staples in the respective fields, and co-authored The Translator as a Writer with Peter Bush. In 2015, she published a monograph entitled Translation in the Routledge New Critical Idiom series, and in 2018, she edited the Routledge Translation and Word Literature collection. She has served as a judge in the Women Writers in Translation Prize since 2017, as she is not only a translation scholar and translator, but also an accomplished poet. The lecture Professor Bassnett will be delivering today is entitled The Translational Imagination. And so welcome, Professor Bassnett, Susan. We're happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, great.
Yes.
Thank you for that very, very kind introduction. And thank you also to the organizers for this invitation. I was really looking forward to coming back to Slovakia. I haven't been here for many years. When I was last here, it was Brano Hochel, Professor Hochel, who showed me all round and looked after me for the week I was here. And I had the great honor also of a long meeting with Professor Dionish Jurishin, which I well remember. So we're going back in time away, but it was very, very lovely visit. And I'm so sorry not to be back this time, hopefully in the future. Now, I'm going to start out just with I don't use PowerPoint, by the way, so you just have to listen to me, because I'm not going to be doing anything technological, which is probably heresy in a conference of this kind, but hey, I do what I do. And I want to start out with 2 images. Just to the north of me, there is the famous Roman wall, World Heritage Site, Hadrian's Wall, which goes from one side of Britain to the other and was erected as a barrier between the English and the Scots. Many of you will have heard of this, but what you probably haven't heard of is that some way just north of the wall is an area called the Debatable Lands. And this was an area of total lawlessness for centuries. It was not until the 17th century, when England and Scotland were joined together as one kingdom after the death of Queen Elizabeth I, that attempts began to suppress these centuries of violence. And it's always seemed to me that, in a way, Hadrian's Wall and the Debatable Lands are sort of metaphors for translation. Because the one is a barrier, It's designed to keep people out, but then translators face a barrier across which they have to transpose a text. And that means crossing the barrier, crossing the wall, also means crossing into a space that doesn't belong to anyone. A no man's land, a space of not belonging, a contested space. And you might think how many times in translation studies, metaphors of not belonging have appeared. It's also a space, like the debatable lands, that's often contested by both sides. And in translation, you have both source and target who continually challenge the work that a translator has done. Once again, this year, we might think of the case of the translators in Afghanistan who are seeking to leave the country in fear of their lives. And that also shows the extent to which many translators and interpreters have been seen over the centuries as betrayers of whichever side happens to have won. So right now in the 21st century, there are many other debatable lands where there's distrust on all sides and translators are operating in a hostile environment. Because there is a fundamental issue with all forms of translation, and I would add interpreting, in that this act is an activity that depends on trust. The receiver of a translation has to trust the translator because the original, the source, is inaccessible to that receiver. And this would seem to be perfectly straightforward. All those of us who work in translation know this. But it's not straightforward. And the history of translation is full of moments when translators have been banned, have been persecuted, have been imprisoned, even killed. You might think of Jan Hus, who was burned at the stake for his heretical translations of the Bible, as was the Englishman William Tyndale, and of course the extraordinary English medieval translator, or I should say Reformation translator, John Wycliffe, died naturally, and some 40 years after he died, the authorities came, dug up his bones and ceremonially burned them. So this just illustration of the extent to which translation and translators have been responded to, let's say, with violence and hostility. Now, Lawrence Venuti, who we shall be hearing from later today, talking about values in translation, says this: translation, like every cultural practice, involves the creation of values, linguistic and literary, religious and political, commercial and educational. What makes translation unique is that the value-creating process takes the form of an interpretation inscribed in the source text, whose own values inevitably, and I think inevitably is going to be a key word in what I have to say, inevitably undergo diminution and revisions to accommodate the receiving culture. Now, we all know that no translation can ever be the same as its source. But although anybody working as a translator or an interpreter accepts this as a given, in the world beyond academia, that fact is often hard, if not impossible, for people to absorb. The discourse of faithfulness, accuracy, exact equivalence is still widespread. In the popular imagination, perfect translation not only exists, but should exist, because anything less is judged to be inauthenticity, unfaithfulness, inaccuracy, in short, betrayal, and hence the distrust of translators and interpreters. Now, Peter Davies from the University of Edinburgh is a scholar of both translation studies and Holocaust studies. And in an important essay entitled Ethics and the Translation of Holocaust Lives, he tackles the ethical issues around the translation of Holocaust testimonies, questioning whether the two fields can at times be in conflict. He asks some important questions. What if a translator reads a testimony text differently from a Holocaust scholar? Does that translator become a sort of secondary witness? And what happens when the translator engages in the unavoidable reshaping process of a text? How can one ensure the authenticity of the voices of victims of trauma when a translator is involved? And Davis urges that more attention should be paid to what he calls the complexity, the specificity, and the autonomy of translation as a skill. But he also says it's important that we know more about translators themselves and their working conditions. Obviously, what he has to say about the role of translation in Holocaust studies can be applicable to other contemporary situations, including translators, interpreters in refugee camps and centers where the task is to translate stories of trauma and cultural displacement. Now, the American scholar Hayden White expanded the use of the term imagination, which is in my title, to include how narratives are constructed from traces of the past. White introduced the idea of the historical imagination, which has led on to the idea of the ethnographical imagination, the archaeological imagination, the geographical imagination. And that notion of imagination challenged the belief in concrete, so-called scientific evidence, and invites reflection on the ways in which we create narratives that shape how we see the past and the present. The archaeologist Karen Sanders has pointed out, and this is a rather nice statement, that the term of imagination has become a way to unleash the objects of investigation. Unleash, that is set free. I have dogs, so I think of unleashing the dogs and they run. Has become a way of unleashing the objects under investigation from the correctness or tyranny of predetermined disciplinary methodologies. So we're back to challenging that there is a right way to do things. So imagination, in Sanders' terms, creates an interdisciplinary landscape in which concepts can travel freely between different fields of study. So I suggest that we might want to consider the translational imagination, since ideas about what translation is and how it works are indeed constructed from all kinds of traces. And running through any attempt to talk about translation are conflicting views that constantly call into question predetermined disciplinary boundaries, such as a translation should be faithful, can never be faithful. Translation always involves some kind of loss. Translation always involves some kind of gain. All texts are translatable in some way. At the heart of translating is untranslatability. These are some of the opposing positions constantly in circulation. Now, I'm with Professor Venuti when he urges us to stop saying that texts are untranslatable and start realizing that every text is translatable because every text can be interpreted. Venuti said this in just a couple of years ago. He will probably say it again later today. I think it's pure common sense, but it's highly contestable by people who disagree with him. Each individual translator, though, interprets a text in his or her own way. Hence the plurality of versions of the same text, notably those that have been with us for a very long time. And Matthew Reynolds, a translator and translator scholar at Oxford, has just brought together a collection of essays called Prismatic Translation, in which he sees translation as a prism, refracting language, reflecting it in ways, of course, this is an image that André Lefebvre used many years ago. Translation, he says, is something that opens up the plural signifying potential of the source text and can spread it into multiple versions. Now, over the years, I've become very interested in multiple versions. This is what I do in my teaching with my MPhil students in the University of Glasgow, as I used to do at Warwick. I make them look at different versions of the same text, usually taken across different times, and we consider the different strategies, the different aesthetic norms that can be seen in those texts. I've also become very interested in the debates that this arouses, and I came across just when I was preparing this talk, I came across an essay by the American novelist Cynthia Ozick, who she also translates, actually, and it's an essay on translating Franz Kafka, and she speculates on the enormous problems of translating a writer who, as he wrote in a letter to a friend, claimed that it was impossible to write in German, yet impossible not to write in German, and then wrote about the impossibility of writing itself. Kafka was clearly a very tormented soul, but his idea is absolutely fascinating. And so Ozick asks the basic question: how can a translator approach a writer like this? And following Walter Benjamin, she concludes that translation, I quote, "Translation is the transmission of that which can be made out of language, but is a condition beyond the grasp of language." And, of course, people continue to translate Kafka. For, as Ozick also reminds us, all translations carry within them their own dissolution. And I think this is another very important point to remember. A translation carries within it its own dissolution. Translations are ephemeral. They don't endure because aesthetic and cultural norms change constantly, and translations need to be revised to accommodate those changing norms. Now, Ezra Pound, great translator, very controversial figure, wrote a little book, curious little book, called An ABC of Reading. And in this book, he basically puts down all sorts of ideas, and he's trying to provide a guide on how to read poetry. How my students actually find this very provocative, but it's quite interesting. So he says this: for those who only read English, I've done what I can. I've translated the Ta Hyo, that's the great learning of Confucius, so they can learn where to start thinking. That's an important point. His English readers will only learn to start thinking if they read a Chinese philosopher. And, says Pound, I've translated The Seafarer, one of the great Anglo-Saxon poems, so they can see where English poetry starts. I don't know how they can get any idea of Greek. There are no satisfactory English translations. Now, years ago, when I came across that statement, I found it very troubling. What did Pound mean when he said there were no satisfactory English translations, given that there were hundreds, probably thousands, of extant translations of ancient Greek literature? One of the very earliest translations of Homer was the English Renaissance poet George Chapman, who in 1660 published, I love this title, The 7 Books of the Iliad of Homer, Prince of Poets, followed later by a complete edition, The Iliads of Homer, Prince of Poets, never before in any language truly translated. And they did this kind of self-promotion in the Renaissance publications, but I still rather like to look at it. But I think that description of Homer, Prince of Poets, is really rather interesting. And centuries later, 2 centuries later, the English poet Keats read Chapman's version of Homer and was so impressed by it that he wrote a poem, famous, a sonnet, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. It's an unusual text in that it's a poem about reading a translation of a poem. I use this with my students quite a bit as well. And And in a letter to a friend, Keats said this: "Chapman feels and writes as a poet, as Homer might have written had he lived in England in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. It is an English heroic poem, the tale, that is the plot, of which is borrowed from the Greek." Now, Keats was interesting because Keats had not received a classical education, so he was completely reliant on translation. But Ezra Pound said, nobody can get an idea of the Greeks, but Keats, one of our greatest romantic poets, clearly thought that a translation had done this. Because that translation for Keats inspired the awe, he uses the word awe, and wonder of reading something strange and new. Now, one of the most exciting, interesting recent developments for me in the Anglophone world is the rise of a field called classical reception studies. Today, the study of Greek and Latin in the Anglophone world has declined radically, and so all readers are dependent on translations. But many of the translations produced today are a radical departure from earlier ones. And the Latin classicist Stephen Harrison has speculated on why this should be the case. And he argues that contemporary writers, many contemporary writers, are turning to the foundational texts of Western culture, as he puts it, not so much in a spirit of homage as in a spirit of appropriation. And he sees this as a kind of deconsecration of figures like Virgil and Homer, so that the cultural centrality of writers once seen as canonical and so immutable, untouchable, has shifted. And so you have writers like the West Indian Derek Walcott, the Canadian Margaret Atwood, the Irish Seamus Heaney, and many, many others creating translations, and we could argue about whether you see them as translations, but creating works that are dependent on classical material. And Harrison sees this as directly related to a key idea in reception studies, whereby the meaning of a work is realized at its point of reception. As he puts it, after 2,000 years, the classic text of Greek and Rome cannot be read unmediated. We are all children of our own time, with the accumulated cultural and literary assumptions of our time. And so the remaking of ancient literary texts by contemporary writers is merely a particularly creative form of this continual reprocessing of the ancient through the modern. When I was writing this paper, I happened to notice that in the top 10 best-selling books for September 2021, there are 2 novels based on the Iliad, Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles and Pat Barker's The Woman of Troy. In a review of another novel based on Homer, Natalie Haynes' 1,000 Ships, that was published in The Guardian in April earlier this year, the reviewer also refers to these writers. And the title of that review was interesting. It is Epic Win: Why Women Are Lining Up to Reboot the Classics. And the reviewer points out, though, that the fact that many contemporary novelists are now using classical texts as the source of their inspiration, they are doing this in what she calls a mode of creative excavation. There's that archaeological image again, creative. And she says, the reviewer says, and I think it's quite right, that Euripides, who was writing in a particularly destructive and cruel period in the 5th century BC, was also thinking in a similar way about the conflict's effect on women. Now, purists could say, well, look, these aren't translations, these are just novels based on Homer. Now, I differ. I think that although they are not close translations, these novels couldn't have come into being if there hadn't been an Iliad and an Odyssey. And moreover, and this is coming out strongly in classical reception studies, the novels, what exactly are the source texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey? A number of translators, classical translators, including Josephine Balmer, who has translated Sappho, Catullus, Ovid, among others, she calls herself a transgressive translator. And she justifies her transgressiveness on the grounds of the complete unreliability of the source text. Because ancient works have come down to us, they have somehow survived endless textual manipulations by scribes, translators, commentators, scholars, editors, printers, publishers, all the other agents, which call seriously into question what any original might have been. In the case of Homer, of course, we've got the added dimension of oral poetry. So at some point, whatever Homer may have sung is transcribed by someone, somewhere, somehow, in some alphabet and in some language, and has come to be handed down. Now, there's an American graphic artist called Eric Shanoa, and he started on an absolutely massive project to translate all the stories of the Trojan War and to include them in a series of comic books. And so far he's done 4, and they are very, very complex indeed. But in an essay, a graphic essay, so he draws himself speaking, and he has this to say. The essay is called 21st Century Troy, or How Do You Solve a Problem Like Iphigenia? And he says this: the story of the Trojan War is at least 2,800 years old. That's a lot of time to accumulate variations in all sorts of media: poetry, plays, prose, painting, sculpture, opera, pop music. The story grows heads like a hydra. Troilus is mentioned only once in Homer's Iliad, but gained a death that was developed in vase paintings, gained a lover called Cressida in the Middle Ages, was taken over by Shakespeare in the Renaissance, and was given his own opera in the 20th century. Reconciling contradictory versions can be very tricky, like the one popularized by the 6th, 7th century BC poet Stesichorus, where Helen never went to Troy, but stayed in Egypt throughout the war. And I like Shanoa's very irreverent, but nevertheless very entertaining idea that there basically isn't a single source text. There is something that has come down to us through endless textual manipulations. And Josephine Balmer, in one of her essays, says, in addition to all this textual difficulty, what do we know about these actual poets? Did Homer even exist? There's one theory being put forward that the Iliad was composed by a man and the Odyssey composed by a woman. Did he exist? Where did the story that Homer was blind come from? Centuries after his death, somebody came up with that. She also says, we have no idea what these ancient texts even sounded like. We might have transcripts of something, but what did they sound like? The language, long dead. How people spoke. I used to, when I was a student in Italy, I used to entertain my friends by occasionally reading Latin texts on monuments with the sort of pronunciation that the English students were taught. And my Italian friends would just fall about laughing because the two variations on what Latin sounded like between English and Italian are simply absurd. And if anyone wants to try this, you can try. I'm sure there is a Slovak way of pronouncing Latin as well, which will be different from both of those. Now, Eric Chano's essay came out in a book published in the Oxford Classical Reception series. Am I all right for time? I'm just asking. Madam Chair, am I okay?
Yes,
Yeah?
yes.
Okay for time? Good. Because I've just got about another 10 minutes I can have, yes?
You can have half an hour.
Oh, Lord. I don't think I'll need that. But anyway, let's hope we have questions. If I have half an hour, people will go back to sleep. Yeah, Eric Chano's essays come out in a collection of books by Oxford University Press called Classical Reception Series. And Bloomsbury have just got a classical reception series because I've just written an essay for a volume there. So this idea of classical reception is really gaining a lot of momentum in the Anglophone world. And the collection in which Chano's essay comes is called Classics and Comics. There's been a follow-up, Son of Classics and Comics. I keep meaning to write to the editors and say, what about Daughter of Classics and Comics? But the idea behind these volumes is that the study of the classics used to have high culture associations. But now the discipline is changing and has expanded to include how the ancient world has been reinterpreted to serve more contemporary purposes. Classics is now recognized, or now recognizes, I should say, that all audiences are legitimate ones. And interpretations of the ancients have been mediated by the accumulation of so many other interpretations over the millennia. And this is what the editors have to say. If any reading is an interpretation, and therefore a reinterpretation, our understanding of an ancient source will be enriched by looking at how that moment has been understood and read by others. Sometimes readings may be poorly or mistakenly informed. That does not make them illegitimate, however. Plenty of operas and theatrical adaptations, to take examples from so-called high culture appropriations, are taken without any interest in understanding how the source text originally created its meaning. What matters is the decision to use the past to make sense of the present. And I should just point out here, my son is an archaeologist, and his interest in archaeology, as he's very clear, was roused partly by me reading stories of ancient myths and so on to him when he was small, but also as he got older, through playing computer games, through particularly the ancient war games, through cinema. There are all kinds of fascinating reinterpretations of the ancients in visual form, in animated form, in ways that have probably reached far, far more people, certainly far more young people, than ever any of the more high culture versions did. So I come back to this sentence. What matters is the decision to use the past to make sense of the present. And I want to give you a couple of examples now of translators who've done exactly that. The first of these is a Northern Irish classicist and poet, rather great poet, called Michael Longley. And in an essay that he called Lapsed Classicist, he explains how translating Homer, opened things up for him. It enabled him, he says, to be able to write lamentations for his parents long after they had died. And it also empowered him in the years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Civil War in Northern Ireland, to write about the local conflict through translation. This is something, those of you who know anything about Seamus Heaney will know he's done exactly the same through the classics, and also in Heaney's case through Dante. So through translating ancient works, in fact, my colleague and collaborator David Johnston at the Queen's University Belfast, he is of the view that translation, and particularly translation of ancient texts, has been one of the most significant aspects of the civil conflict in Northern Ireland, and the way in which translation has enabled poets, enabled writers to talk about what was going on in front of them. In this essay, just a short essay, Longley says, "I've been Homer haunted for 50 years. And I like that, Homer haunted. I think if I were saying that, I would say I have been Dante haunted. Not quite for 50 years, but certainly Dante haunted for a very long time." And then he explains how he came to write a sonnet called Ceasefire that came to symbolize the beginning of the Northern Irish peace process. And that sonnet was published in the newspaper, the Irish Times, in 1994, one day after the declaration of a ceasefire by the IRA. So here you have the beginning, or the hopes of the beginning of a peace. And Longley explains that he had been reading the Iliad, and in book 24, the old king of Troy, Priam, goes to the Greek camp. The Greeks are besieging the city. The armies are all around the city. And the old man goes out, and he goes to the man who's killed his son, Hector. And that man is Achilles, the Greek hero. And he goes because he wants his son's body back for burial. It's a very risky, dangerous thing to do. David Malouf, the Australian writer, has written a marvelous novel about precisely this episode. So he goes, the old king leaves the city, he goes to the Greek camp, and Achilles has a flash of memory, a flash of recognition. He remembers his own father, and so he treats the old man very kindly. And Longley says this, "Psychologically, this scene felt very modern, but I wanted to compress the scene's 200 lines into a short lyric. So I got started by playing around with the sequence of events. In Homer, at the beginning of their meeting, Priam, the old king, kisses the hand of his enemy. Longley says, I put this at the end of my poem, and I inadvertently, that is without knowing, created a rhyming couplet. And what is that rhyming couplet? Well, I don't have time and I won't read you the whole poem, but I will read you the rhyming couplet because it's so incredibly powerful. Spoken by the old king. I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. This poem, hugely successful, read not only by classicists, but read by anybody that picked up a copy of the Irish Times on that day. And translation, says Longley, has been fundamental to his own imaginative development. But with regard to this extraordinary and very powerful little poem, he just says, it was Homer that spoke across the millennia. I was only his mouthpiece. Again, we can debate whether taking several hundred lines, changing the sequence of events and turning it into a 14-line sonnet is a, I use inverted commas, faithful translation. But to me, it has everything to do with the, let's say, the way in which Longley reimagined what Homer in that 24th book was seeking to do. Now, another example, the classicist Alice Oswald, a poet, classicist, she published a poem called Memorial with a subtitle. And here again, this archaeological image, an excavation of the Iliad. This is a long poem. It consists of two parts. The first part is a list of names presented in capital letters of every single man who is killed in the Iliad. Just a list of names. And in the second part, she begins to expand on those names and writes for each person what she calls a biography. And she says, my biographies are paraphrases of the Greek. My similes are translations. But my approach to translation is fairly irreverent. I work closely with the Greek, but instead of carrying the words over into English, I use them as openings to see what Homer was looking at. I write through the Greek, not from it. I am aiming for translucence rather than translation. And here, as with the prismatic image, that idea of the prism, translucence, which is something with light, so showing light through, but not necessarily transparent. Transparent, translucent are different concepts. Now, Oswald's poem, I would see it is a translation that, like Homer, like Longley's sonnet, radically reduces the Iliad in order to sharpen the focus. What she does is she focuses on the horror and the pity of war, which is exactly what Longley's doing. And the English poet and classicist Christopher Logue spent 40 years producing a version of the Iliad. It was finally published in 2016 after his death, called War Music, subtitled An Account of Homer's Iliad. And my edition has a red cover with a military helicopter on it, a contemporary military helicopter. And here too, you see that the purpose behind this is to, as the editor says, what does he say? To startle us into recognition of what Homer was saying about our condition. And I actually came across that because I was rereading for teaching purposes the Iliad, and I realized I hadn't read it completely from beginning to end for many years. And I was pretty shocked when I read it by the graphic violence. I don't know how many of you have read it recently, but it is full of gruesome, violent accounts of killer blows and horrible wounds. And then I thought, how interesting that I'm shocked by this, because I'm a child born in the 20th century, so my life has been filled with stories and images of war. For my father, who was away in the Second World War for 4 years. In my student days, the images of Vietnam. My children have grown up with images of wars in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Yemen. We're inundated with images of war in the 20th century. They were often sanitized for TV audiences. But reading Homer's poem about an imaginary war that may or may not have ever happened thousands of years ago, nevertheless reminds us, I think, of just how devastating, vicious and cruel all wars can be. And the poets that I've just been referring to you are people who seek to put the horror and pity of war into a contemporary context. Okay, I'm not that far off the end now, so hope is in sight. I said I'd written an essay for a new volume in the Classical Receptions series of Bloomsbury, and this is on the Canadian translator, poet, classicist Anne Carson. She's mainly known as a translator of Greek drama. She is a simply astonishing woman, and her work is powerful, disturbing, and I think she stretches the limits of what it actually means to be a translator. And I came across in one of her little think pieces. You can't even call them essays. They're just little fragments in which she jots down thoughts. And this is called On Walking Backwards. And she makes a connection between translation and engaging with the dead. This is what she says. My mother forbade us from walking backwards. That's how the dead walk, she used to say. Where did she get this idea? Perhaps from a bad translation. The dead, after all, do not walk backwards. They walk behind us. They have no lungs, but would love for us to turn around. They are victims of love, many of them. And here what Carson is saying, she's using this lovely image, that a bad translation is not forward-looking. It walks backwards, as her mother imagined the dead might do. Whereas what the dead desire is to be seen, to become visible again. Walking behind the living, the dead hope that someone is going to turn around and give them a renewed voice. For Carson, the dead are actually walking forwards, but behind the living. And although they can no longer breathe, they still have stories to tell, stories that can only be told by the living who look back at them, who translate them. And it's easy, of course, here to hear echoes of Walter Benjamin in what Carson is saying. But I found this a fascinating image, the idea of the dead constantly walking behind, willing the living to turn round and give them a new voice. And in an interview in the Kenyan Review, Carson explains that how does she translate? She says, well, I distinguish between a commissioned translation. In a commissioned translation, I'm given certain parameters. So I've got to follow, in a sense, follow the rules. That's what they want. The client wants me to do this, so I'm constrained by that. But when I can choose for myself, I can have what she calls a free adventure of creativity. And she says this, I generally try to work first and foremost, don't forget she is a classicist, so she's not creating a text, she is well able to understand the Greek. I try to work first and most attentively out of the grammar, syntax, allusions of the original, while keeping the language alive in a way that interests me. Then later, I crazy it up, if it seems appropriate. Now, crazying up for Carson, I love that term, crazying up. I wish all my students would crazy up their translations. Crazying up the translation in new, unexpected ways. How does she do this? She might add contemporary references, such as the names of politicians, shifting linguistic registers. She adds comedy to moments of high tragic tension. One of her most wonderful scenes is Cassandra, who has been brought to the house of Agamemnon, and an encounter between Cassandra and Clytemnestra. Cassandra, of course, knows she's going to die. She knows everyone's going to die. And Clytemnestra is certainly going to kill her. But it's presented as a comic scene. And some of the American sitcoms, and something like, I don't know if you've had it yet in Slovakia, if you can get it on Netflix, Succession. The language, it's the TV series based on a character like Rupert Murdoch. Very funny. Carson turns Clytemnestra into a sort of, middle-class Hollywood wife sniping at Cassandra. It's very funny. What she does, she disturbs her readers. She seeks to disturb them and challenges them to think about what the stories are that the dead still have to tell. Now, of course, endless translators over the centuries have also done this. I'm particularly fond of Antoine de la Motte, who translated the Iliad in the 18th century and cut out 50% of the poem together in such a way, as he says in his preface, to form a better proportioned and more sensible whole than Homer's original. And the other one I particularly like is Jean-François Ducy's translation of Hamlet, enormously successful, went for decades, performed, but he he made so many changes to the play, including cutting out the ghost of Hamlet's father, the play within a play, all the sword play, all the action. In other words, we would say removing just about all the elements that thrill people today. But he pointed out that this was all inadmissible on the French classical stage. And then he had the problem of what to do with Hamlet's ghost, Hamlet's father's ghost. This is how the play starts. This is how the whole thing. So he wrote a scene. He wrote a scene in which Hamlet speaks to the urn containing the ashes of his dead father, which I think is a rather clever translation solution. It begins, "Dread and holy urn, I invoke thee," and it was enormously successful. So he cut the ghost, but he still had the presence there. In other words, while translators, though, like de la Motte and Dissy, were shaping their translations to conform with contemporary aesthetic norms, I think the focus today of literary translators is much more on their own creative development. And dealing with ancient texts, they are empowered to do so by a shift in attitude towards ancient canonical culture. The great Jorge Luis Borges, who I'm always fond of quoting, says that there are never any definitive texts. There are only drafts. And in his essay on translations of Homer, the Homeric versions, he says, "To assume that any recombination of elements is necessarily inferior to its original form is to assume that draft 9 is inferior to draft H, for there can only be drafts." And I love that. There's no such thing as a definitive text. Now, to conclude, all translators are creative in the way that they are rewriting for a new set of readers. They are rewriting a text that came into existence in another moment, in another place. Sometimes that original happened 2 hours before for an interpreter. Sometimes the original carries traces of years, decades, cultures, millennia of textual manipulation and intervention by many hands. And I think if we accept this, we can accept what Borges is saying when he says all texts, all versions are merely drafts. And I want to end with a friend of mine, a late Northern Irish poet, Kieran Carson, who brilliant translator, translated from French and also from Irish. He was an Irish and a bilingual person. And in 2005, he published a translation of The Midnight Court, which is an 18th century poem by an Irish writer who some of you may have heard of, but probably not, called Brian Merriman. But the poem is regarded as a masterpiece of Irish literature. Carson includes a preface to his translation, and he writes about how translating Merriman felt like entering a foreign country, where suddenly both the source and target languages became unfamiliar. And, he says, as I worked my way through the translation, it sometimes seemed to me that I was entering another world, where it was always nightfall, seeking for light. Translating well, to Kieran Carson, meant entering that foreign country of the text, crossing, if you like, the debatable lands, learning how to depart from the source, and yet remaining in contact with it through the medium of the new language. And he says this, and I conclude with this statement. Of course the original is changed in the process. How could it be otherwise? But so is one's mind, one's understanding of what the words could mean, and that is how it should be. A translator must enter that foreign country and learn its language anew. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for this. Oh, well, I was totally immersed, and I made like 7 pages of notes. So fascinating talk. So many references, so many great texts you referred to, and yes, Jan Pedersen, who's in the audience with us here, already has prepared a question. So
good.
Please. Well, thank you. Thank you, Susan. This was absolutely mind-blowing. I think this was a great lecture, and you gave me much to think about, and I love the way that you problematized the concepts of the source text and the target text, and that they're always liquid in a way, and so on and so forth. And I was hoping to, as you know, to see you here, but now I see you on screen, which is, well, it's the way things are these days. But I have a comment and a question, if I may. The first, my comment is about your metaphor about Hadrian's Wall and the debatable land. And I must say I really love that, because particularly if you're dealing in subtitling, as you know I do, then the idea of going over the top and going into the debatable land. I mean, I think this is true for all translators, that once you press send on your translation, you really tremble as if you were going over the top and meeting the enemy. And then, particularly for subtitlers, but also for other kinds of translators, then your translation is out there for people to criticize. But particularly for subtitlers, and particularly since the source text is there at the same time. So subtitling is sometimes called a vulnerable translation, just because the source and the target text are juxtaposed, so everyone can criticize it. So I think your image there really makes justice to the emotions, I think, that translators feel when going over the top, so to speak. So thank you for that image. I loved it. My question is grounded in your talks about the different versions that are based on the classical texts, and the Iliad in particular, which I read a long time ago. I haven't reread it, but I realized I read it as a teenager, and in Swedish translation, I'm not a classical scholar, and I loved the blood and gore. I mean, as a teenager, all that, it was like watching a slasher movie, really. I may want to read it as an adult, with an adult mind. I do realize that. But my question is, these novels and adaptations that are based on the Iliad, like Malouf's taking the scene and making it into a novel and so on and so forth, that sort of begs the question, I think, of the difference between translation and intertextuality and adaptation. And I wonder what your views on those concepts are. If you could expand on that, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is a great question, and I think it is really, in a sense, the question of the moment. What are the limits? What are the boundaries of translation? And I've prepared some notes for this afternoon's talk. To me, the David Malouf, by the way, the title, just in case anyone's interested, the novel is called Ransom. It's a fantastic novel. To me, they are all translations, in the sense that years ago, when Lefebvre and I were trying to develop our theory of rewriting, they are all rewritings. And you might know that after the Second World War, when the Penguin Classics series was begun, Homer was translated by the English E.V. Rue in prose. And Rue's idea was, well, nobody's going to read an epic poem in the 20th century. Epic poetry has ceased to be, certainly in the Anglosphere. Therefore, what are people going to read? Well, they're going to read novels. So we create a translation in prose. what the contemporary feminist novels, I referred to Pat Barker, for example, these are retellings of the Iliad from a woman's perspective. And again, I would argue that there is behind this source, I mean, I can't even say a source text, because we know that there's so much Homeric material. This is the point of Shanoa, there's so much material. But nevertheless, she has read and interpreted something that came to her from a translation from the Greek, whichever one she read, and she has written a version of her reading for 21st century readers. And this is also a novelist. In her case, she's a novelist who's probably best known for her books about the First World War. So it's the war theme that she's taken up. So yes, to me, I'm still going to go with the idea that this is a rewriting. And if all translation, some of it is perhaps closest to the source, some of it further away, but I still think, I'm still going to go with it being a translation, however contentious that might be. And I'm just a little note on this, Jan. It's interesting that you said you liked the blood and gore, because of course that is what Hollywood is doing now with the Iliad and with ancient Greeks. I mean, look at the enormous success of the 300, the big success, Brad Pitt in Troy, which I thought was a terrible film, but nevertheless, big audiences. And the blood and gore is really part of, if you like, the 21st century rethinking. And so the novels, the feminist novels, are offering an alternative, a feminist reading to the blood and gore that you enjoyed as a teenage boy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question and for the answer. Are you happy with the answer, Jan?
Oh, yes, very much so. And I quite agree with you. I thought the Brad Pitt adaptation was dead boring, really, considering the source material. But just to follow up on that, then, if you have such a broad definition of a translation as to mean basically rewriting, is that still going to be useful in practical terms? Because then just redrafting could then be seen as translation as well, couldn't it?
I've always been intrigued by the, in a sense, the looseness of the term translation, because translation is also a pedagogical tool. If you are learning a language, translation, and often the kind of translation that we would not want, is part of the language learning process. And one of our distinguished poets, Tony Harrison, has a lovely anecdote about how when he was at school, he was translating a passage from Plautus in his Latin class. And he decided that this was a scene in which a policeman, an ancient Roman policeman and Roman authority figure, wanted characters to move. And so he used some of the kind of language that a comic, because bear in mind he's translating a comic play, a comic representation of an English policeman might have said. So he wrote, "Hello, hello, hello, what's going on here?" And the Latin master crossed it out and wrote, "The correct translation is vacate the thoroughfare." Now, clearly, it was vacate the thoroughfare. The Latin was that. But what Harrison had done, this sort of teenage boy, had decided to interpret. And I've often thought, what would I have done if I'd been marking that? And I think I probably would have, rather than cross it out in red ink, I would have drawn his attention to the difference between what Balmer calls a transgressive translation and the literal translation of the Latin. So I think pedagogically, close translation is still very useful. But the brief today was to talk about creativity, which is what I've been trying to do.
Right, thank you. I have more questions, but I'm going to leave the floor now because it's rude otherwise.
Thank you very much. So we do have some questions on Slido. Let me remind all those who are watching us that you can ask questions through Slido. The code is hashtag TIC 2021. So now the first question from the audience is, may one state a translator as a traveler constantly on the move? Translation is a journey. And thank you very much for the lecture, yeah, as well.
Oh, that's very nice. Yes, I think in a way, a translator is moving through time and space. Translation involves movement, all kinds of movement. Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, travel is a bit of a sore point at the moment, since I should be there with you and I have not been able to travel. But the whole question of traveling is whether one travels with a destination in mind or whether one just travels without a destination. And so I think I would want to look more closely at the notion of travel, because the other thing is, as travel writing theorists have so often said, the travel narrative so often has a start and an end, and the end point is that you go back home. And so I'm not absolutely, but yeah, translation involves movement. It involves travel. Yes, I'll go with that.
Thank you. I think Michael Cronin was talking about wayfaring, like not going from point A to point B, but wayfaring and concentrating on the journey.
That's a really good word, and that's one of these sort of things that we can do in English. There's a lot that you can't do in English, but English does have all these what I've called quasi-synonyms that are not quite synonyms. But so wayfaring is not quite the same as traveling, but it involves a notion of travel. And I think wayfaring, which is a slightly archaic word, nevertheless is actually a very appropriate one for a translator.
Thank you. So another question I have here is, how would you suggest incorporating the imagination and the crazing up in translation training and also in assessment tasks for students? So you were talking about two ways of translating precision versus creativity.
Well, I think in a sense, I've half answered that in talking about the Latin translation. I think I can give you an example from one of my classes in an MPhil class a couple of years ago in Glasgow, where I was looking at theatre translation, and the class were looking at the last scene of a Pirandello play, which the Italian version is Così e se vi pare. And in the last scene, the whole play, I mean, I won't bore you with the details, but it's an enigma. People, one set of people think somebody is one person and the other. It's typical Pirandello. So the final scene is the denouement. The lady who has been in complete silence all the way through the play comes on stage and she says, I'm really going to tell you the truth. And everybody goes, yes, yes, now we'll get the truth. And she says, I am Signor Ponce's wife and I am Signora Frola's mother. And this is the very dilemma that they've all wanted her to say, I am one or the other. And that's why the title, Così è, that's so, se vi pare, this is it, if you think it is. So there's no resolution whatsoever at the end. So I gave this scene to the students, and there were three young men from Glasgow, and they were I got them to do some rephrasing because it was a very dull translation. And they used as a model a television show that had been very controversial. One of those shows where there's a presenter. This presenter was called Jeremy Vine, and was it Jeremy? Anyway, the people would come on, and there would be tremendous conflict, and it was a hugely successful daytime TV show. Absolutely horrible. And I thought, this is brilliant. They are so right. Pirandello is very contemporary, but they are using, as an example, a TV show that is popular it hinges entirely on not just who's right, but who's telling the truth. And so I thought that in terms of the class. And so the next time I was teaching that text, I brought what I'd learned from the students to the next generation of students, and we discussed it. So I think there's lots of ways in which you can find your own examples of crazying up and look at and get students to think about what a text is doing and what they can draw on from their own culture. Because the other thing I think is so important to remember is that not just is that students, a new generation, is always coming with new ideas, new thoughts. They are listening to new music. They're engaging in social media in the ways that I can only begin to imagine. So I think that's also very important to get them to think how they would crazy something up.
Thank you. Thank
But
you very
there are,
much.
oh, sorry, just one last thing. There are obviously no rules for crazying up. That's individual.
I think everybody has their own rules for crazying up.
Absolutely.
Okay, so some kind of all history and culture seems like the history of creative shifts, mistranslations, and well, that's how we live. That's what we are, kind of. I really like this dictionary of untranslatables, I think. It's a collective work. And I was thinking about that thing while we were speaking. Do we have any other questions from the audience, either here or through Slido? Jan would like to ask something.
Yes, well, if there is time, I have another question that I would like to ask about something which is something you said earlier on in your talk when you're talking about there never being such a thing as the correct translation, and people think that there is correctness. And we, of course, we've traveled beyond that, surely, in our wayfaring to know that there is no such thing. But then you drew a parallel to research, saying something similar goes for research, if I could remember correctly, and that there is no one right way to do research. But and of course, there are many approaches to research, but what about replicability? I think that the received truth these days is that studies should be replicable and that there is indeed a right way of doing research. Or have I misunderstood you?
No, I wasn't actually talking about research, but you do raise an important point. And I am one of the reasons why I do not use PowerPoint, but I just talk and hope that something of what I have to say goes through. As you probably noticed, occasionally you see the flash of a hand because I use my hands all the time, which is not coming across on the screen. But I like when I'm doing a lecture with students, or when I'm doing it face to face, I like to have, I was going to say interference, but I like to have reactions from the audience. I see the teaching as a way of, it's almost like a performance, really. One is presenting things, one is reacting to the public. I mean, this is actually very difficult now because I am looking at myself on two screens. This is really weird. There's the one that you can see, and there's another one of me. And I have to say that the lip sync is not quite right, which you, Jan, will appreciate as a subtitler. So I'm seeing myself. Yeah, I'm seeing myself speaking in one way, and then a second later, there's another, but there's two images of me. There's no image of the public. There's no sense of how many people are listening to this. There could be 6, there could be 600, I don't know. And this actually is very disconcerting. And it kind of removes the sense of spontaneity. But I think for me, one of the downsides of having to use a lot of electronic presentations in order presumably to cope with what I'm talking about is the real risk of replicability. which takes me back to when I was a student and you had the appalling elderly professors who would bring out their lecture notes that had turned yellow with age and would read them again. I like the idea of spontaneity. So I did write a text for this morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your great talk and for the little discussion, which is a kind of a tasting for the afternoon roundtable, which will take place or start at 3:30. And the title of which is Translation and Creativity in the 21st Century. And besides Professor Bassnett and Jan Pedersen, we will be joined by Lawrence Venuti. Thank you very much for listening and watching and talking and thinking, and see you.
Thank you all. Thank you.